It's tax season. And you may have heard that our already obese military budget is getting a 10% raise, and that's not including a 7.3% raise for Homeland Security. If you're like me, you look at that and think, oh, for fuck's sake, that means that this 2015 breakdown is going to see even more of that slice go to bombing innocent kids thousands of miles away, while we see an increase in homeless, hungry, and miseducated, if not altogether uneducated kids here at home. And if that makes you sick, check this out. The National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, an organization dedicated to providing information, support, and resources to people and groups who choose to resist paying federal taxes, due to the fact that most of it goes to funding death and destruction. To get more of a scoop on resisting war taxes, we sat down with Sam Koplinka-Lair, the community organizer and outreach consultant for National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. Take a look.
As long as there has been war, there have been war tax resistors, dating back hundreds and hundreds of years. Here on this continent, the Algonquin tribe in the 1600s refused to pay taxes to the Dutch because the Dutch wanted to build a new fort. And so that was a method of tax resistance at that time in the 1600s. There have been famous war tax resistors throughout history. And the modern war tax movement started in around the 1940s with World War II. And since then, there have been war tax resistors in the United States for the past 70 years, at times upwards of a few 100,000 war tax resistors. People who refuse to pay taxes to the U.S. government because of the way that the money is used for war, for police, for prisons, for these systems of oppression that we don't believe that's how we should be spending our money in our communities. And so we refuse to pay taxes in order to, as an act of civil disobedience, in refusal with how this money is spent.
So, I mean, the question, the automatic question that then arises is, isn't it illegal to not pay taxes? And there was a recent Guardian article where Ruth Ben, a coordinator for the NWTRCC, she said that she hadn't been taken to court. There weren't any holds on her bank accounts or anything. She did get a small amount taken out once. But others have had their lives destroyed by the IRS. Talk about like this difference and the legality of not paying taxes.
Right. So there's many different ways that people practice war tax resistance, some of which are illegal. If you owe taxes and you do not pay taxes, technically that is illegal under the tax code and under the laws. So there are people who have been prosecuted for that, whether that's actually being taken to court or getting letters from the IRS. There's, in general, the number of people who face consequences, prosecution, jail time, is very, very low compared to the number of people who practice war tax resistance. In the past 80 years or so, there have been less than 100 cases where there's actually been charges brought against people who are war tax resistors. And that's compared with hundreds of thousands of people who have actually practiced war tax resistance.
Is that a capacity issue? Like the IRS just can't find all of you? Or is it based on how much you owe each year?
I guess it's a little bit hard to say. In the past decade or so, it's definitely a capacity issue, and that the IRS has faced funding cuts. And so we have seen in the past few decades a remarked decrease in the amount of sanctions against war tax resistors. If the war tax resistance movement continues to grow and grow and grow, my guess is that we'll see an increase in terms of prosecutions and that kind of thing. So it does seem as though it changes over time, depending on the number of war tax resistors and depending on the capacity of the IRS. The one thing that I would say that a lot of people do get, though, is letters from the IRS. In general, if you're a war tax resistor, you get a whole stream of letters from the IRS. Everything from, hey, you owe taxes, to we're planning on seizing money from your bank account, and all sorts of threats there. They do get money seized from their paycheck or their bank account. It depends case to case. A lot of war tax resistors have never had any seizures of their bank account or what have you. Others have regular seizures of their bank account. So it really depends on the person and on the situation, it seems.
So in that same vein, part of what the committee does is walk people through how to avoid paying federal taxes, and that there seems to be an emphasis on federal taxes, not state and local taxes. Talk
Right.
about that difference, and also like what an example of like a few of the steps that you tell people to take.
Right. So our organization, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, or NUTRIC, we support folks who refuse federal taxes. And the reason for that being is that the federal income tax has been the focus of where most of the military spending comes from. There are some state funds like National Guard and what have you, but for the most part, the military industrial complex comes out of the federal budget. And so that has been the primary focus of our resistance and the work that we do. There are war tax resistors that refuse state and local taxes for varying reasons, sometimes because of money that goes to prisons or the police or other forms of oppression. But our work is supporting people who refuse federal taxes.
So talk about this support network. Is it also like a legal support network that you offer, or is it basically just here's how you go about doing resisting taxes?
Yeah, so we're not lawyers, we're not accountants or tax professionals. We don't say that we're offering any type of legal or tax advice. It really comes out of decades and decades of experience. And so this network of across the entire country, in every state and most cities, you can find somebody who is a resource, who's been a war tax resistor and can walk you through at least their experiences with it, and walk you through different tactics that war tax resistors use. But that said, we're not telling people what they should do. We're really providing resources, saying these are some ways that people have done war tax resistance. We can't and shouldn't say this is how you should do it. But it's really about mutual support and mutual aid. So there is elements of organizing as well. So, for example, if somebody has their money seized, for example, and it's a financial hardship for them and they can't make rent or that kind of thing, then that's a way in which, as people in that community, we can support them. We can do fundraisers so that they can pay rent, that kind of thing. So the power comes from having tens of thousands of people who are supporting each other in a network, not necessarily saying you're going to have a lawyer if you're taken to court. There are lawyers who do support our network, but that's not a guarantee. It's really about a mutual aid and support.
So in that same vein, I noticed your shirt. Talk a little bit about the privilege
Right.
that is involved in tax resistance and how you might guide someone who wants to consider tax resistance as civil disobedience. What would you say to them based on their specific type of privilege?
So our identities are constantly coming into play when we're thinking about action. And even just the notion of taking a calculated risk, it comes out of a place of privilege. If you're black in this country, you're targeted, period. You could get arrested walking down the street. And so, in terms of thinking about, I want to take a calculated risk of civil disobedience, that's, in many ways very white. And so the network historically has been predominantly white, and there are risks, especially for people who don't have citizenship status. If you're undocumented, if you're trying to get papers, if you're trying to go for citizenship, war tax resistance is not recommended. One of the first things for citizenship that they look at is whether or not you've paid taxes, and so that is a huge thing that you need to consider if you're undocumented. For the most part, I would say that that's the element of privilege around, especially whiteness, that really we need to be upfront about, and that if you are black, if you're brown, you're being targeted, period, and that taking on additional risk is something that you need to think about. This can be a tactic for folks who want to not pay for the bullets that are killing their children. If you're black, if you're brown. And yet it also needs to be something that's carefully considered, just like any direct action. Yeah.
So, talk about if you or in fact the organization has a perspective on this, because there are factions like libertarians and people like that feel that paying any sort of tax is not, it's not a good thing and it infringes upon our freedoms. Does the committee have a perspective on that, and
Right.
also like an alternative to the federal military industrial complex tax, like
Yeah.
it's like, oh well, we support a kind of system that would give people the right to choose where their taxes go.
Right. Great question. Yeah, so there are again, there's many different type of war tax resistors, people who come from all sorts of different walks of life. There is a campaign within the movement called the Peace Tax Fund, which is trying to um, trying to get legislation at the federal level that would allow people to mark that they don't want their taxes spent in certain ways. That's one movement. There's also, in general, war tax resistors redirect their tax money. And they, instead of paying it to the federal government, they take that money and they give it to other organizations. So this year, what we are encouraging folks to do in their communities is redirect that money to resistance that's led by Black folks, brown folks, indigenous people, and really taking money from the U.S. government, which is in many ways a white supremacist organization, and giving that money to folks who are targeted by state violence and targeted by white supremacy, who are doing fierce organizing in our communities. So that's really the difference, I would say, between us and kind of a libertarian tax resistance movement is that we are encouraging people to take that money and put it in their communities to build the world that they want, to build a world where we're actually fighting for peace, where we're fighting for justice, where our communities are fighting against these different forms of oppression.
So
Yeah.
it is sort of this idea of you're building an alternative in your own communities while fighting an oppressive system.
Exactly. Yeah, and that the money is actually a direct way to do that. As you're refusing money over here, you can reinvest that money in the things that you actually believe should be in your community.
For more information on war tax resistance, visit nwtrcc.org.